The morning Clarence Whitaker rode into Sorrow Creek Valley with a leather satchel full of money and a contract already drafted. Nobody warned him that the woman who owned the land at the end of the road was the kind of person who could break a man's certainty the way a hard frost breaks thin glass, quietly, completely, and without a single moment of hesitation. It was the spring of 1882, and the Arizona Territory was still a place where a man with enough capital and enough nerve could reshape the landscape to suit his ambitions. The railroad had pushed its iron veins deeper into the territory every year, and where the rails went, money followed, and where money followed, men like Clarence Whitaker were never far behind. He represented the Whitaker Land and Development Company out of Tucson, a firm his father had built, and which Clarence now ran with the kind of steady discipline that made rivals nervous and partners grateful. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than just appearance, with dark hair that wanted to curl at the edges when the desert heat got thick, and eyes so deeply brown they sometimes looked black in poor light. He wore good boots and a clean hat and carried himself without arrogance, though he had plenty of reason to carry it if he wanted to. The valley itself was something that stopped a man's breath when he first rode into it. Sorrow Creek cut a silver line through Red Canyon walls, and on either side of it the land opened up into grass so green it looked almost impossible against the surrounding desert. The Vaughn land sat at the heart of it, 460 acres that straddled the creek, with a modest ranch house, 2 working barns, a bunkhouse, a kitchen garden that ran along the south-facing slope like a patchwork quilt, and enough cattle to prove the land was genuinely producing. The railroad surveyors had identified the valley as the ideal route for the next leg of the Southern Pacific expansion, and the Whitaker Company had been tasked with acquiring the necessary parcels. Most of the smaller landholders had already sold. The Vaughn property was the last significant holdout, and it sat directly in the path of the planned line. Clarence had reviewed the file before he left Tucson. The property was held by Irene Vaughn, age 27, widow of Thomas Vaughn who had died of a fever 18 months prior. The notes said she had no children, had kept the ranch running with a small crew, and had rebuffed 2 previous written inquiries from the company. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Gerald Pratt who sweated through everything he wore, had handed him the file with the weariness of a man who'd already given up and said, "Just go out there and make it real for her, Clarence. Make the money real. Women in her situation usually come around when they see the actual bills laid out on a table." Clarence had nodded and taken the file, and said nothing about the fact that Gerald Pratt had clearly never met a woman in any particular situation, and drawn any correct conclusions from it. The road to the Vaughn property wound along the creek for about 2 miles after the gate, and Clarence rode it slowly on his gray horse, which he called Newton, mostly because the horse had a philosophical temperament and never seemed surprised by anything. The morning light was golden and flat across the grass, and somewhere in the cottonwoods along the creek, a meadowlark was working through its whole repertoire. Clarence found himself slowing down more than the road required, just looking at the place. It was genuinely beautiful. He could understand why a person would not want to leave it. He had halfway hoped she'd be in the house when he arrived, so he could do the thing properly, knock on the door, hat in hand, state his business, sit at a kitchen table. Instead, he found her in the corral nearest the main barn, doing something that made him stop Newton entirely and just watch for a moment. She was working a young Palomino horse on a long rope, moving the animal in wide circles around her, and the way she moved with it, keeping her body perfectly positioned and her gestures small and clear, told him she knew exactly what she was doing. She was wearing work trousers tucked into tall boots, a loose cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbows, and a battered hat that had clearly seen several seasons of hard use. Her dark hair was pulled back, but several pieces had come free around her face. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the horse. He tied Newton at the fence post and waited, because it would have been rude to interrupt, and because he found he didn't want to interrupt anyway. After another few minutes, she brought the Palomino to a halt, rewarded it with a pat on the neck, and only then turned to look at him. Her eyes were gray, which surprised him. Gray was unusual in that country where everyone seemed to end up with eyes the color of the sky or the earth. They were calm eyes, but not empty. There was a great deal of attention in them. "You're from the railroad company," she said. It was not a question. "I'm from the Whitaker Land and Development Company," he said. "Clarence Whitaker. We've been acting on behalf of the Southern Pacific in this region." "You can get back on your horse," she said pleasantly, and turned back to the Palomino. He didn't get back on his horse. He said, "Mrs. Vaughn, I understand you've received our letters. I came in person because I believe a conversation is worth more than a letter, and I think you deserve to hear the full offer explained properly." She turned back around and looked at him with an expression that was neither hostile nor especially welcoming. She seemed to be making some assessment of him that he couldn't quite read. "You're younger than I expected," she said. "I'm 31, he said, which wasn't quite an answer but was the only thing that came to mind. "The last fellow they sent was older and considerably more certain of himself," she said. "He left here with his certainty somewhat reduced." "I heard about that," Clarence said. The previous representative had apparently made the mistake of informing her that a woman alone couldn't realistically maintain a property this size, and that she'd be doing herself a favor. She had escorted him off the property so decisively that he'd filed a report with the company describing her as difficult and possibly deranged, which Clarence suspected meant she'd simply disagreed with him. "Then you know my position," she said. "I know what you said in the letters," he said. "I'd like to know your position properly, if you'd be willing to talk it through with me. I'm not here to tell you anything about what you can or can't manage. I'm here to make a business case and let you decide." She looked at him for another long moment. The Palomino nudged her shoulder from behind, and she reached up automatically to scratch under its jaw without looking at it. The gesture so practiced it was unconscious. Something about that small automatic gesture did something unexpected to Clarence's composure, and he made himself keep his expression steady. "Come inside then," she said at last. "I'll put coffee on. But I'll tell you right now, Mr. Whitaker, that coffee doesn't mean yes." "I understand," he said. The kitchen was clean and functional and smelled of bread that had been baked earlier that morning. There were dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, sage and rosemary, and something he didn't recognize, and a window above the basin that looked out across the kitchen garden toward the creek. He sat at the table she indicated and set his satchel beside his chair, and she moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been doing these things alone long enough that every motion was perfectly calibrated. "My husband's family tried to buy this land from us 6 months after Thomas died," she said from the stove, not turning around. "Did your file tell you that?" "It didn't," he said. "His brother Owen. He came out here with a very reasonable offer and a very reasonable face, and he explained to me that a woman alone, with no family of her own nearby, with a mortgage to service and a crew to pay, really would be better off taking the money and going somewhere that made sense for her situation." She set the coffee cups on the table and sat across from him. "I told him to get off my land. And has your situation improved since then?" He asked, and he kept his voice genuinely curious rather than pointed, because he was genuinely curious. "Considerably," she said. "I renegotiated the mortgage terms with the bank in Millhaven. I've got 4 men on the crew now, and we turned a profit last year for the first time since Thomas got sick." She looked at him directly. "This land has been in my husband's family for 20 years, and he left it to me because he wanted me to have it. I don't intend to let it go because it's convenient for a railroad." "Mrs. Vaughn," he said, "I respect that position genuinely. And I'm going to be honest with you about something, which I suspect is not the approach you've been used to from company representatives." He opened the satchel and set the envelope on the table between them. The offer in that envelope is $12,000. That is 3 times the assessed value of the property, and considerably more than we have paid any comparable parcel in this valley. The railroad is going through this valley one way or another. The route is surveyed and approved. If the negotiated acquisition fails, the company will pursue eminent domain proceedings, and the court determination typically awards assessed value only, not market premium. She looked at the envelope without touching it. You're telling me to take the money before I get less. I'm telling you what will happen if we can't come to an agreement, he said. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the legal reality of the situation as I understand it. She was quiet for a moment, both hands wrapped around her coffee cup. The meadowlark he'd heard by the creek had moved closer to the house, and he could hear it through the window, clear and liquid in the morning air. The route doesn't have to go through the heart of the property, she said then. I've looked at the survey maps. If the line ran along the eastern edge, following the base of the canyon wall, it would add maybe a quarter mile to the route, but it would leave the creek frontage and the best pasture land intact. Clarence blinked. You've looked at the survey maps. I borrowed them from the county office in Millhaven 6 weeks ago, she said. Where did you think I'd been while your company was sending letters? I've been educating myself. He sat back in his chair and looked at her with the first completely unguarded expression he'd shown since arriving. That's a reasonable proposition, he said slowly. Technically reasonable. I don't know if it's something the railroad engineers would accept without. I'm not asking you to commit to it today, she said. I'm asking you to take it back to the people who make those decisions and find out. Because if there's a route that doesn't require me to leave, and doesn't cost the railroad significantly more to build, then there's a solution here that doesn't require a fight. He looked at her for a long moment. He realized, revising a significant number of assumptions he had arrived with. I'll take it back to them, he said. Good, she said, and refilled his coffee without asking if he wanted more. He stayed for another hour, and most of it was not about the land at all. She asked him how long he'd been doing this kind of work, and he told her about starting at his father's company at 20, learning the business from the ground up, and eventually taking over the day-to-day operations when his father's health began to decline. She asked if he liked it, and he paused before answering, which seemed to interest her. I like solving problems, he said. The land acquisition part of it, I don't always like that. It's not usually straightforward, and the people selling usually aren't selling because they want to. Then why do you do it, she asked. Because I'm good at it, he said, and because when I do it, at least I try to do it honestly. He looked at her. I told you immediately about the eminent domain option. Most representatives wouldn't do that until much later in the process. You did, she agreed. I noticed that. When he left, he shook her hand at the door, and she had a grip that matched his without trying to prove anything by it, just the natural handshake of someone accustomed to work. He rode back along the creek road, and the meadowlark was still singing, and Newton moved along at his own placid pace, and Clarence found that he was not thinking about the railroad or the survey maps or the eminent domain timeline. He was thinking about gray eyes and the automatic gesture of a hand moving to scratch under a horse's jaw. He wrote a detailed memo to the engineering office in Tucson when he got back to the hotel in Millhaven that evening. He laid out Irene Vaughn's alternative route proposal carefully and objectively, listed the technical advantages and disadvantages, and requested a formal engineering review. Then he went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a while before sleep came. The engineering review took 10 days. During those 10 days, Clarence stayed in Millhaven rather than returning to Tucson, because there were other smaller land matters to attend to in the area, and because he told himself that Millhaven was the appropriate place to be while waiting for the review response. He did not examine this reasoning too closely. On the 4th day, he rode out to the Vaughn property again, not with company business, but with what he told himself was a professional courtesy visit to let her know the review was underway. He found her in the kitchen garden, kneeling in the dirt between rows of beans that were just beginning to climb their poles, doing something careful and attentive with her hands to the base of each plant. She looked up when she heard his horse, shading her eyes with a soil-dark hand. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I wanted to let you know the engineering review has been requested," he said. "It'll take another week or so." She stood up, brushing her hands on her trousers. "You rode 2 hours to tell me that." He felt the color come up the back of his neck and was grateful for the hat brim. "I was in the area," he said, which they both knew was not entirely true. She gave him a look that said she knew exactly how true it was, and then she said, "Stay for dinner. Miguel cooked a chicken this morning and there's more than we'll finish." He stayed for dinner. Miguel was her most senior ranch hand, a man of about 50 with a face like weathered cedar and a reserve that softened somewhat when he decided Clarence was not going to cause trouble. The other 3 hands, a young man named Dooley who talked constantly, an older fellow named Abe who didn't talk at all, and a quiet Navajo man named Running Bear whom everyone called Bear, ate at the long table in the bunkhouse, but Irene brought plates out to them herself before sitting back down at the kitchen table with Clarence. "Do you always eat with them?" he asked. "They're my crew," she said simply. "This ranch only works because they work it. Eating separately seems pointless." After dinner, she showed him the water management system Thomas had put in before he got sick. A series of earthen channels and small dams that moved creek water to the higher pasture areas during dry periods. It was cleverly built, and she explained it with a clarity that made obvious she'd learned, and internalized the whole thing herself rather than relying on the hands to manage it. "Thomas was an engineer before he ranched," she said, standing at the top of the main channel where the view opened up to show the whole southern pasture gilded in late afternoon light. "He designed most of this before we married. We came out here together when I was 20 and he was 26. "How long were you married?" Clarence asked. 6 years, she said. "They were good years." She said it without the quality of grief in it that he'd half expected and without the quality of closing a door on the subject either, just simple truth. "He got sick in the winter of 1880. It took almost a year." "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I'm sorry too," she said. "But this land is what he built and I intend to keep it the way he'd have wanted." She looked at him sideways. "That's not just sentiment, by the way. That's also business sense. This valley has the best water access in the region, and it's only going to increase in value. Even if your railroad goes through, the land that remains will be worth significantly more in 10 years. "You've really thought about all of this," he said. "I've had to," she said. "Nobody was going to think about it for me." He rode back to Millhaven in the last of the evening light with something moving quietly in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, if he was honest about it, which he was increasingly finding he wanted to be. The engineering review came back positive. The eastern route was technically feasible, added only 340 yards to the plan line, and required no significant additional infrastructure beyond a single additional culvert for a seasonal wash crossing. The cost differential was negligible. The chief engineer's memo was blunt. Accept the alternate route and acquire only the necessary right-of-way easement along the eastern edge. Full property acquisition is not required. Clarence rode to the Vaughn ranch with the memo in his satchel and a straightforward sense of purpose that lasted precisely until he saw her come out of the barn with a smear of grease on her cheek and her hair coming entirely down from its pins, because she'd been working on something mechanical. And then his straightforward sense of purpose acquired a very complicated second layer. He told her the news and watched her face. She didn't whoop or throw her arms out or collapse with relief. She stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, and he saw her exhale very slowly, and when she opened her eyes they were bright with something she was keeping carefully in order. "The easement," she said. "What are we talking about? Width?" 60 feet along the eastern boundary line, he said. "The company would need to purchase the right-of-way rather than the full parcel. Based on acreage at fair market value, that comes to approximately $940. "I can live with that," she said. "I thought you might," he said. She stuck out her hand and he shook it, and she had the grease smear on her cheek and her hair falling around her face, and he held her hand perhaps 1 second longer than a handshake strictly required, and she noticed but did not say anything about it, though her eyes did something complicated. "Come and see what I was working on," she said, and he followed her into the barn. It was a pump mechanism for the water channel system, one of the valves that controlled flow to the upper pasture. She'd partially disassembled it trying to clear a blockage, and the problem was that the valve seat had warped slightly from age. She explained the issue clearly and without any suggestion that she expected him to have a solution. "I'm not much of a mechanic," he said, "but I know there's a man in Millhaven, name of Hector Suarez, who does metal work and fabrication. He could probably machine a replacement seat." "I know Hector," she said. "I've used him before. I'll send Dooley in tomorrow." She looked at the disassembled valve. "I hate when things break. It always happens when there's already too much to do." "What else is happening right now?" he asked. "Calving starts in 2 weeks," she said. "Bear is good with the cattle, but it still means everyone working long hours for most of a month. And the south pasture fence needs 300 yards of new wire before then because the winter did damage." He was quiet for a moment. Then, more or less without deciding to, he said, "I don't have to be back in Tucson for another 10 days. If you want an extra set of hands for the fence work, I can string wire." She looked at him with an expression that moved through surprise and calculation and something softer, all in sequence. "You'd string fence wire. I spent 2 summers doing ranch work as a young man," he said. "Before I went into the company, my father thought I should know what the land was actually worth in human terms before I started buying and selling it." "Your father sounds like a thoughtful man," she said. "He was," Clarence said. "He died last year." She looked at him with recognition of shared loss, simple and direct. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry too," he said, and then they were both quiet for a moment in the dusty barn with the late afternoon light coming through the gaps in the boards, warm and full of floating motes, and somewhere outside Dooley was whistling something off-key and cheerful. "All right," she said. "You can string fence wire, I'll feed you, but I'll pay you the going day rate same as the other men." "Mrs. Vaughn, I don't need, it's not charity," she said firmly. "You work on this ranch, you get paid for it. That's the way I run things." He started to say something and then thought better of it and said, "Fine." "Good," she said, and picked up a wrench. He worked for 4 days on the south fence line with Abe and Bear, who were both initially suspicious of him in different ways that eventually resolved themselves when it became clear he knew what he was doing and didn't complain about the work. Abe warmed up on the 3rd day enough to tell him, in 3 sentences, that he'd been on the Vaughn place for 8 years and that Mrs. Vaughn was the best boss he'd ever worked for, and that the previous company representative had been the rudest man to set foot on the property in his memory. And then Abe went back to being quiet, and that was apparently all the opinion he intended to share. Bear was more forthcoming. He was from the Navajo Nation originally, had come south following work 15 years earlier, and had ended up on the Vaughn property when Thomas Vaughn had hired him because he was the best horseman at a Millhaven trading post where Thomas had gone to buy a remuda of working horses. Bear had stayed because, as he told Clarence with a level directness that left no room for sentiment but none for falseness either, "Mrs. Vaughn treats people straight. That's not common." "No," Clarence agreed. "It's not." "You like her," Bear said. Clarence opened his mouth and Bear looked at him with such patient certainty that he closed it again and then said, "Yes." "She's worth liking," Bear said. "Don't make it complicated." In the evenings Irene cooked, and Clarence ate at the kitchen table and they talked. They talked about the land and the cattle and the water system. They talked about Tucson and the way the town was changing as it grew, and about the politics of the territorial government and the question of statehood that everyone had an opinion on. They talked about books. She had a case of them in the sitting room, read and reread, and she lent him a copy of a George Eliot novel that he admitted he'd never read, and she expressed a severe opinion about that admission. They talked about the injustices that the railroad expansion had brought down on the smaller communities in its path. The homesteaders pushed off by eminent domain with inadequate compensation. The Mexican families who'd held land grants for decades and found those grants suddenly legally ambiguous when a corporation wanted the land. And the Navajo and Apache peoples who had watched their territories reduced again and again to suit the convenience of settlers and companies alike. He found her opinions honest and clear-eyed, and they pushed at the edges of his own thinking in ways he welcomed rather than resisted. On the fifth day, a Sunday, there was no fence work because the crew took Sundays as rest, and Clarence woke in the small room she'd offered him in the ranch house to the sound of rain. Not the violent thunderstorm kind, but the gentle, steady kind that in the Arizona territory felt like a gift, slow and even and thorough. He found her on the covered porch with coffee and a book, her legs folded under her on the bench, and she handed him a cup without looking up from the page as if she'd known he was coming. He sat in the other chair and listened to the rain and drank his coffee and read the Eliot she'd lent him, and for a very long time neither of them said anything, and the silence was the most comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said eventually, still looking at her book. "Yes," he said. "Have you ever come close to marrying?" He considered being vague and decided against it. "Once," he said. 7 years ago. She was a woman I'd known since we were both very young, and we were well-suited in the practical ways people talk about being well-suited. But she chose to marry someone else, and I think she made the right choice." Irene looked up at him over her book. "Why the right choice?" "Because I think she loved him and I think I just expected to love her," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment longer and then looked back at her book. "Yes," she said, "there is." He worked the last 2 days of fence wire, and then the contract documents for the easement came through from Tucson by post. And on the morning of the 10th day, he set them on the kitchen table and she read every word before she picked up the pen and signed. She had asked him 3 clarifying questions during the reading, and he had answered each of them without trying to rush her. And she had made one notation in the margin about a survey reference that she wanted corrected, and he wrote the correction into both copies himself and initialed it. When she put the pen down and looked at him across the table, he felt the weight of the moment. This was the thing he had come here to do professionally, and it was done, and there was now no business reason for him to remain on the Vaughn property or in Millhaven at all. "I should get back to Tucson," he said. "I know," she said. He stopped. He looked at her across the table, and everything he might have said about business and professional obligation and the inappropriateness of the rest of it felt suddenly both true and completely insufficient. "Mrs. Vaughn." "Irene," she said. "Irene," he said, and her name in his mouth felt like something important. "I would like to write to you if that would be acceptable." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "About what?" "About anything," he said. "About the land and the cattle and the water system. About George Eliot. About whatever you think is worth saying." She looked at him with those gray eyes that were doing the complicated thing again, and then she said, "Yes, Mr. Whitaker. That would be acceptable." "Clarence," he said. "Clarence," she said, and she didn't look away when she said it. He rode back to Tucson with Newton at a steady pace, and the letter he'd begin that night already composing itself in his head. The company was satisfied, the easement was signed, the route was settled, the Vaughn property would remain intact except for the narrow right-of-way along its eastern edge. Gerald Pratt shook his hand and made a comment about how the woman must have finally seen reason, and Clarence said she had been entirely reasonable from the beginning and left it at that. He wrote the first letter that night, sitting at his desk in the Tucson house that had been his father's, and now felt very large for one person. He told her about the ride back, about a dust devil he'd ridden through 10 miles out of Millhaven that turned Newton into a momentary philosopher of wind, and about the city as it looked coming into it from the desert, the adobe and the new brick buildings and the constant sound of construction. He asked about the pump valve and whether Hector Suarez had been able to machine a replacement seat. She wrote back 8 days later. The letter was 2 pages in a clear, precise hand that looked like someone who'd had good schooling and had continued to use it. The pump valve was fixed. Calving had started, and they'd had 6 good ones in the first week, and only 1 difficult delivery that Bear had managed admirably. She'd finished rereading the Eliot and had started something by Henry James that she found more challenging and less immediately satisfying, but possibly worth the effort. She had attended a town meeting in Millhaven regarding the right-of-way compensation payments to the smaller landholders, and had argued publicly for a review of the calculation methods, which had not made her entirely popular but had resulted in the formation of a committee. She had, she said at the end of the letter, enjoyed the 10 days of fence work more than she'd expected. He smiled at that last sentence for approximately 3 minutes. They wrote for 2 months. The letters got longer and the intervals between them got shorter, until he was writing every 4 days and she was writing every 5. He told her about the business, about the cases he found genuinely interesting, and the ones that felt like they were grinding something important down. She told him about a difficult night during calving when they lost a cow and spent 3 hours bottle-feeding the calf, and about a dispute with a neighbor named Birch who kept letting his cattle drift onto the east pasture, and about the committee in Millhaven that had succeeded in getting 2 of the smaller landholders a revised compensation calculation that was somewhat closer to fair, though not as close as she'd wanted. He rode back to Millhaven in June on the pretext of following up on a minor boundary survey matter that he could have handled by post. He didn't try to pretend otherwise when he arrived and she came out to meet him at the gate. "The survey matter," she said, "is straightforward," he said. "I could have sent a letter." "I know," she said, and there was something in her voice that was warm and careful and honest all at once. "Come in. I'll put coffee on." "I know coffee doesn't mean yes," he said. "It means I'm glad you're here," she said. "That's enough for now." He stayed a week. During that week, the neighbor Birch showed up one morning to continue a long-running argument about the east pasture boundary, and Clarence was present for it and watched Irene handle the man with a combination of patience and absolute firmness that was genuinely impressive. Birch was the kind of man who took a woman's patience as an invitation to push further, and when he pushed further, Irene simply laid out the legal boundary documentation she had clearly had ready for exactly this occasion, and told him in a voice of complete calm that if his cattle crossed the line again, she would be filing with the county sheriff and the territorial land office simultaneously. Birch left grumbling and Irene turned back to the coffee she'd left on the porch rail with an expression of someone who has been putting up with a particular inconvenience for too long and is getting fairly tired of it. "He'll push again," Clarence said. "He'll push twice more and then he'll stop," she said. "That's his pattern. He pushed twice with Thomas, and then Thomas went over there and made very clear that further pushing would have consequences, and Birch backed down." "Do you want me to?" "No," she said, and she said it pleasantly but completely. "I'll manage Birch myself, thank you." He felt something that was not quite embarrassment but was adjacent to it, and also something that was respect, and he said, "Of course." "I don't say that because I don't appreciate the offer," she said, looking at him directly. "I say it because Birch needs to know that I manage this property, not that a man who visits here manages it. If you handle it, it teaches him the wrong lesson." "That's exactly right," he said. "I should have understood that without you having to explain it." She looked at him for a moment. "You're learning," she said, and there was something in it that was not quite a smile but was close. On the 4th evening of that visit, after dinner, they were sitting on the porch watching the last colors drain out of the western sky, coral and gold and the deep blue that follows them, and the conversation had come to a natural resting place, the kind that only happens between people who have become genuinely comfortable with each other. The creek was audible from the porch, its voice low and steady, and somewhere in the cottonwoods an owl had started its nightly announcements. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said, not turning from the sky. "I want to be honest with you about something. "You've been fairly honest all along," she said. "That's one of the things I've noticed about you." "I want to be honest about this specifically," he said. "I'm not in Millhaven about a survey matter. I'm in Millhaven because I've been thinking about you since I left in April and the letters weren't enough and I needed to see this place again and I needed to see you." She was quiet. The owl called twice. The creek kept its own counsel. "I know this is," he started. "Complicated," she said. "Yes. You work for the company that wanted to buy me out," she said. "That's still true." "It is. And the easement is signed, and the railroad will build through the eastern edge of my land in the fall." "That's the schedule, yes. And you will have professional reasons to be in this area sometimes, and personal reasons that are separate from those." "Yes." She turned to look at him then, pulling one knee up on the bench and facing him directly. In the diminishing light her eyes were very clear. "I have been thinking about you since April as well," she said. "And the letters have been good, but they haven't been enough for me either." Something in his chest that had been careful and tightly organized for most of the spring came loose in a way that was entirely welcome. He said, "What would be enough?" "Time," she said. "More of it. Actual time, not letters. I am not a woman who makes decisions quickly about things that matter." "That's one of your better qualities," he said. "I have several," she agreed, and that was nearly a smile. He came back in July and in August. Each time he stayed longer and each time he left with more difficulty. He helped with the summer branding, which was honest hard work that left him too tired to be anything but himself, and he found he liked that quality of the ranch. It burned away the professional manner and the careful self-presentation, and left just the actual person. Irene seemed to appreciate the actual person well enough. She fed him well and worked him honestly and talked to him like someone whose opinion she valued, but was not required to share. The railroad construction reached the eastern edge of the Vaughn property in September. He came out for it, not because the company required his presence, but because he wanted to be there in case it was hard. The survey crew and the construction gang came through on a Tuesday morning, following the line that had been staked out along the base of the canyon wall, well clear of the creek and the good pasture. Irene stood at the fence and watched them work, and he stood beside her, and he could see the tightness in her jaw and the controlled evenness of her breathing. "They're well clear of the creek," he said quietly. "Yes," she said, "and the fence goes back after they're done." "I know," she said. "I read the easement." He didn't say anything else. He just stood there beside her, and after a while the tightness in her jaw eased a little and she didn't move away from where their shoulders were nearly touching. When the construction gang had moved on down the valley and was out of sight, she said, "Thomas would have been furious. About all of it, the railroad and the valley at all." "What do you feel?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I feel like I made the best of what I had to work with," she said. "And I feel like the valley is still here, and the creek is still here, and the cattle are still here, and that matters more than being furious." "It does," he said. She looked at him then, and whatever had been building quietly between them for 5 months was very present in that moment, visible and mutual and no longer needing to be careful about itself. He reached out and she took his hand, and they stood like that in the September sun with the sound of the construction crew fading down the valley and the creek running bright and clear in its course, the way it had always run. "Clarence," she said. "Yes," he said. "Don't leave for Tucson tonight." He stayed. And then it was October, and the mornings were sharp with the first edge of autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek were turning gold. And Clarence had made 8 trips between Tucson and Millhaven since April and was finding the distance increasingly unreasonable. He had thought about this carefully and from multiple directions, the way he approached most things, but he had also begun to recognize that this particular thing would not yield to careful thinking the way most things did, and that what it actually required was honesty. He arrived on a Friday afternoon, and she came out to meet him at the gate, which she had not always done before, and he thought the fact that she had come out this time was its own kind of answer to a question he was about to ask. She was wearing her good dress, which he had only seen twice before, a deep green cotton that suited the gray of her eyes in ways she was probably aware of and certainly didn't intend to mention. And he thought she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, not in the way that was about the dress or the light, but in the way that was about who she was, the completeness and clarity of her. He got down from Newton and held the reins and said, "I have to stop making trips from Tucson." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that right?" "It's too far," he said. "8 trips in 6 months, and every time I leave I'm already calculating how soon I can come back, which is not an efficient way to run a business or a life." "No," she agreed. "I have been thinking," he said, "about whether the Whitaker Company operations couldn't be based out of Millhaven as effectively as out of Tucson. The regional land matters are all in this area, and the Tucson office can handle the southern operations independently, which they've been doing for a while anyway." She was looking at him with an expression that was careful and warm and waiting. "And I have been thinking," he continued, "that if I were to relocate to Millhaven, I would need a reason beyond the business one, a reason that was honest and that you agreed to." He looked at her directly. "Irene, I'd like to marry you if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. The creek was talking to itself behind the property fence. A crow went overhead with something significant to say. Newton bumped Clarence on the shoulder with his nose, either philosophically or because he wanted water. It was sometimes hard to tell. "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you might," he said. "This land stays in my name," she said. "Not transferred, not jointly deeded. Mine." "Agreed," he said. "The ranch decisions are mine to make. You can advise, but the final word on this property is mine." "Agreed," he said. "And if the Whitaker Company ever attempts to acquire land in this valley again through methods that aren't honest, I'll know about it and I'll expect you to tell me about it." "I would tell you about it regardless," he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Clarence, I'm a widow who has been running this property alone for 2 years. I'm not a woman who needs to be married. I'm a woman who wants to be married specifically to you, and there's a difference." "I know the difference," he said, "and I want you to know that I understand it and I think it matters." She looked at him for one more long moment as if she were reading something and wanted to be sure she had it right. Then she said, "Yes." He felt something open wide in him, bright and clear like the valley in the morning. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "Now come inside. Miguel made tamales and they're better warm." They were married in November at the small church in Millhaven, a Saturday morning with the mountains dusted in the first snow of the season, and the sky so blue it seemed painted. The church was not large, and the guest list was not long. Miguel and Dooley and Abe and Bear from the crew. A handful of Irene's neighbors who had become genuine friends over the years, including a woman named Clara Pemberton, who ran the dry goods store, and who cried through the whole ceremony with cheerful abandon. The banker from Millhaven who had renegotiated Irene's mortgage and seemed genuinely pleased by the occasion. And a few people from the Whitaker Company side, including Gerald Pratt, who behaved with somewhat more dignity than his usual standard, and who told Irene afterward that he could see why Clarence had made so many trips to the valley, which was the most perceptive thing Gerald Pratt had ever said. Bear stood up for Clarence, which Clarence had asked, and Bear had accepted with a single nod that communicated everything necessary. Clara Pemberton stood up for Irene. The minister, a lean man named Reverend Cole, who had been in the territory long enough to have opinions about everything and the good sense to keep most of them to himself during other people's ceremonies, said the words clearly and well. When he asked if Irene took this man, she said, "I do," in a voice that was completely steady and completely certain, and Clarence felt it in his chest like a bell struck clean. Afterward there was a gathering at the ranch with food and fiddle music that Dooley turned out to be surprisingly competent at, and Miguel and Clara Pemberton danced with the serious enthusiasm of people who don't get enough chances to dance, and Bear sat on the fence rail and watched everything with the expression of someone who is privately pleased with how things have turned out. Irene and Clarence stood together in the late afternoon light of the November yard, and she leaned back against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And the cottonwoods along the creek were bare now but still golden, the last of the leaves not quite gone yet. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Extraordinarily," she said. Clarence kept his word about relocating the business operations. He found an office in Millhaven above the hardware store, hired a capable young man named Philip Reyes who had been looking for exactly this kind of work, and within 2 months the regional operations were running as smoothly from Millhaven as they ever had from Tucson. He rode out to the ranch every evening. Within 3 months he was doing less riding and more staying, which made Newton a happier horse and Clarence a better version of himself than he'd managed in years. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was mild enough. The cattle came through in good condition. The water system functioned as Thomas had designed it, and Irene kept it running with the same attentive precision she brought to everything. The kitchen garden went dormant, and the barn cats got fat on the mice that always moved toward warmth in cold weather. And in the evenings, Clarence and Irene sat by the fire in the sitting room with books or paperwork or conversation, and the house felt inhabited in a different way than it had fuller. The neighbor Birch pushed twice more, as Irene had predicted, and on the second push Irene filed with the county sheriff, exactly as she'd said she would, and Birch was assessed a modest fine, and the boundary was formally resurveyed and marked in a way that left no technical room for further ambiguity. Birch was furious for about a month and then got over it, and the following spring he actually tipped his hat to Irene in the Millhaven post office, which she accepted with a politeness that cost her nothing. In the spring of 1883, Irene told Clarence on a Tuesday morning over coffee that she was expecting a child. She told him in the same direct way she told him most things, straightforwardly, looking at him, without building up to it or softening the approach. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment and then came around the table and took both her hands, and she looked up at him, and they were both quiet for a moment that felt like it had a great deal of room in it, warm and full. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. Not as bad as some women have it. If you need to slow down on any of the physical work, I'll know when I need to slow down," she said. "Of course you will," he said. She squeezed his hands. "Clarence, I'm happy." "I'm so happy I can barely get words around it," he said, which made her laugh. A real laugh, full and warm. She kept working through the summer with the modification that Bear and Miguel, both of whom she trusted more than she trusted most medical opinion and certainly more than any unsolicited advice, quietly adjusted the crew's schedule so that the heaviest work always had an extra set of hands. She didn't ask them to do this, and they didn't tell her they'd done it, but she noticed and understood, and one evening at supper she said to them collectively, "Thank you," and that covered it. Clarence proved less able than Irene to approach the whole thing with equanimity. He rode to Millhaven in August specifically to make sure he had identified the best possible doctor in the territory for when the time came, and came back having spoken with 3 different physicians, and made arrangements with one in Millhaven named Dr. Anita Reyes, no relation to his office manager Philip, who turned out to have studied medicine back east and had been in the territory for 4 years. She was brisk and capable, and clearly had no patience for anyone who questioned her competence on the basis of gender, which Irene liked immediately. "She'll do very well," Irene told Clarence when he came back from the 3rd doctor visit looking like a man who had been conducting a formal audit. "She has excellent references," he said. "I could see that from the first 5 minutes," she said. "I just wanted to be thorough." "You're thorough about everything that matters to you," she said, and she said it with enough warmth in it that he understood it was not a complaint. Their son was born on a November morning in 1883, exactly 1 year and a few days after their wedding, in the room in the ranch house that looked out over the kitchen garden and the creek beyond. Dr. Reyes was there, and Clara Pemberton was there because Irene wanted her, and Clarence was in the kitchen doing increasingly frantic things with the coffee pot that nobody needed, but which gave him somewhere to put his hands. Bear sat on the porch in the cold morning air and seemed to be meditating, or possibly just being philosophical in the way that Newton usually was. The boy came into the world with the decisive energy of someone who had plans, crying immediately and vigorously, and letting everyone in the house know he had arrived. Doctor. Rays brought him out to Clarence with the air of someone presenting perfectly satisfactory results, and Clarence held this small person who weighed approximately nothing and felt something shift in him permanently and irrevocably, a realignment so deep it was structural. He carried the boy to Irene, who was pale and tired and entirely herself, and she looked at their son with those gray eyes that held everything clearly and said, "He looks like you." "He looks like a very upset turnip," Clarence said. "A very upset Whitaker turnip," she said, and she was smiling. They named him Thomas James Whitaker Thomas for the man who had built this land into something worth keeping, and James for Clarence's father, who had taught him the value of honest dealing. Tom, they called him from the beginning, and Tom proved over the subsequent months to have an equable and curious temperament that seemed to draw equally from both of his parents. The years that followed were full of the texture of real life, the kind that doesn't arrange itself neatly but that, looked back on, has a coherence and richness that is its own kind of story. The ranch prospered. Irene expanded the cattle operation in 1884 by acquiring a small additional parcel on the north side of the valley from a homesteader who wanted to move on, and she managed the expansion with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Clarence's regional land business continued to grow as the territory developed, but he was careful, more careful than Gerald Pratt would have wanted, honestly about which acquisitions he took on, and he turned down work that would have required him to push smaller landholders off viable properties with inadequate compensation. He had opinions about this that had been sharpened considerably by the events of the previous years, and he acted on those opinions even when it was professionally inconvenient. He also, in 1884, testified before a territorial land review committee on the question of compensation standards for eminent domain proceedings, saying plainly that the current standards were inadequate, and that the disparity between what companies were required to pay through eminent domain versus what they paid through voluntary acquisition created conditions that were fundamentally unjust to landholders with fewer resources to fight the proceedings. The testimony made a small but genuine impact. The standards were adjusted modestly in 1885, not as much as he'd argued for but more than nothing. He wrote to Irene about it from Tucson, where the committee was held, and she wrote back saying she was proud of him, and that she'd made a note to have a slightly better opinion of politicians generally, which for Irene was a substantial concession. Miguel, who had been Irene's most senior hand since before Thomas died, retired in 1885. He was getting arthritis in his hands and had a daughter in Tucson who wanted him nearby. There was a dinner for him at the ranch that included most of the town of Millhaven who had any reason to know him, which was many people, and he cried when Irene stood up and spoke about what he had meant to the ranch, and to her specifically during the years she'd been running it alone. He composed himself admirably and said that Mrs. Vaughn, he still called her Mrs. Vaughn despite 8 years of being told he could use her given name, was the finest person he had ever worked for, and that he was grateful to have seen her settled and the ranch in good hands. Then he looked at Clarence and said, very seriously, "You take care of that place. It matters." "I know it does," Clarence said. Dooley took over as senior hand, which initially seemed like an alarming proposition given that Dooley still talked constantly and had the focused gravity of a young puppy, but which proved in practice to work very well because Dooley was extremely competent and simply preferred to do his work at high volume. Bear stayed on and became, over time, Tom's primary teacher of horsemanship, which meant that by the time Tom was 4 years old, he was sitting a horse with a confidence and ease that startled visitors. In the summer of 1885, something happened that had not been planned. Birch, whose relationship with the Vaughn ranch had settled into a grudging neighborly neutrality, came over one morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Irene recognized as someone who needed help and was having difficulty saying so. His wife, it emerged, was very ill, and he had 2 young children and a ranch that was not as well organized as the Vaughn place, and he was struggling. He didn't ask for anything specifically. He just stood there with his hat and his difficulty. Irene sent Dooley over to help with Birch's cattle work for 2 weeks. She didn't make a speech about it. She just did it. Birch thanked her in a note that was poorly spelled and deeply felt. After that, the neutrality between them shifted into something that was closer to actual neighborliness, the kind that didn't require liking each other particularly but did involve being decent humans when the situation called for it. "You didn't have to do that," Clarence said. "I know," she said, "but he was in trouble and we had the extra hand time and it was the right thing." He looked at her across the kitchen table where she was going through the ranch ledger. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said, not looking up. "I want you to know that I think you are one of the finest people I have ever known," he said. She looked up. "What brought that on?" "Birch," he said. "And any number of other things accumulated across the last several years." She looked at him for a moment with those gray eyes doing the thing they did that said a great deal without requiring words. Then she said, "I think you are one of the finest people I have ever known as well, Clarence. I thought it from fairly early on. You told me the truth about the eminent domain option when you didn't have to. That's when I started thinking it." "I remember that morning," he said. "You were very certain." "I'm usually certain," she said. "What made you uncertain about me?" "Nothing made me uncertain about you," she said. "I was careful. There's a difference." "Is there anything you're still careful about?" he asked. She considered this. "No," she said. "I think I've had time enough to stop being careful." She closed the ledger. "Come here." He came around the table and she stood up and they held each other in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window over the basin, the creak audible in the distance, Tom's voice somewhere outside calling for Bear in a tone of some urgency about something that turned out to be a frog he'd discovered in the water trough. The ordinary beautiful texture of it, all of it, the specific irreplaceable reality of this particular life in this particular place. In 1886, Tom got a sister. Her name was Ruth Ellen Whitaker, and she arrived in April with a considered and deliberate quality, as if she'd taken the time to assess the situation before committing to it. She had Irene's gray eyes and Clarence's dark hair, and a temperament that was, from the beginning, quiet and watchful and absolutely certain of what it wanted. Dr. Reyes, who by now had attended both Whitaker births and had become something like a friend to Irene, said she was perfect. Clarence held her and said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And Tom, who was 2.5 and of mixed feelings about this development, examined his sister with a frog scientist's careful attention and eventually declared her acceptable, which was generous. The ranch continued to grow and change in the years that followed. Irene added a proper dairy operation in 1887, which she'd been thinking about for 2 years and which proved profitable almost immediately. She became involved in the establishment of a proper school in Millhaven, largely because she had 2 children who would need one, but also because the community had been getting along without one for too long and the situation needed correcting. She organized, argued, fundraised, and occasionally resorted to the same quiet, immovable firmness she'd used on everything from Birch to the Whitaker Company. And by 1888, Millhaven had a school with a proper teacher named Miss Hodges, who was young and capable and entirely committed to her work. Clarence had built the Millhaven Land Office into a respected and genuinely useful institution that other landholders in the region came to for guidance on everything from boundary surveys to water rights. He had a reputation for honest dealing that had, over time, made him something valuable that he hadn't anticipated being: trustworthy. People brought him problems they couldn't take elsewhere because they knew he'd tell them the truth. He'd turned down several opportunities to make money that would have required compromising that reputation, and he'd never regretted any of them. He also wrote, eventually, a formal proposal to the territorial government recommending a comprehensive review of land compensation standards, drawing on 5 years of detailed regional case records. It went to a committee that sat on it for 2 years and then implemented about a third of what he'd recommended, which was frustrating but which he accepted as the way these things worked, and continued to advocate for the rest through whatever channels remained open. One evening in the fall of 1888, he and Irene were sitting on the porch after supper. Tom was inside doing the reading that Miss Hodges had assigned, under protest. Ruth was asleep, and the valley was doing what it did on autumn evenings, going through its whole palette from gold to copper to the deep violet that preceded full dark. The creek had the quiet, low voice it took on in autumn, and somewhere a whippoorwill had started its looping call from the cottonwoods. "I keep thinking about that first morning," he said. "When you rode up," she said. "You were working the palomino. I stood at the fence for I don't know how long. I saw you when you rode in," she said. I kept working her because it would have been rude to stop and because I wanted to think about what I was going to say. "What did you decide?" "To tell you to get back on your horse," she said, "which I did." "And then I didn't," he said. "No," she said, "you were very persistent." "I was professional," he said. She gave him the look that was nearly a smile. "You were persistent," she said. "It's all right. I found it appropriate rather than annoying. You weren't pushy about the wrong things." "I hope I was never pushy about the wrong things," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did sometimes in the evenings when they sat like this, the comfortable, natural ease of two people who have been together long enough to know each other's physical presence the way you know a landscape you've walked for years. "You weren't," she said. "You were honest from the beginning, and you let me be myself, and you didn't try to manage me or fix me or position me to suit your convenience. Those are not nothing, Clarence." "No," he said. "They're not." "Thomas was like that," she said. "Direct and honest. I think I recognized it in you." He thought about Thomas Vaughn, who had built the water channels and the barns and left this land to the woman he'd loved because he'd trusted her completely. He thought about the kind of person it took to do all that, and about the kind of person it had taken to keep it going and protect it through 2 years alone, and then through a railroad company and a neighbor, and every other thing the years had brought. He thought about his own father, who taught him the value of honest work and honest dealing, and who had died without seeing any of this, which was the kind of loss that didn't get smaller, but which became something you could carry without it bending you. "I think you should know," he said, "that this is the life I want, exactly this. I don't have ambitions that require changing what this is." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I know that," she said. "I've known it for a while. I just wanted to say it out loud." "Say it out loud again sometime," she said. "I don't mind hearing it." The palomino, whose name was Copper, a name Irene had given her the day after that first morning, was now 6 years old and fully trained, and one of the finest working horses on the ranch. Irene still worked with her sometimes in the early mornings when the light was low and gold, and the rest of the ranch was just waking up, and occasionally Clarence would come out and sit on the fence rail and watch, the way he had that first time, and something in that repetition felt like a kind of gift to him, a thread that ran from that first morning to this one, and connected them with everything that had happened between. Tom, who was 5 by the spring of 1889, had his father's methodical quality and his mother's directness, which was an interesting combination that sometimes expressed itself as a very organized determination to get to the bottom of things. He had decided he wanted to know how the water system worked, and Irene spent 2 Sundays walking him through every element of it, patient and clear, and he listened with the focused attention of someone who intends to remember what they're being told. Bear had told him, somewhat before anyone else had, that the land would be his responsibility one day, and Tom had taken this seriously in the way that children take things seriously when they are told by people they deeply respect. Ruth, at 3, was different in the ways that people are simply different from one another. Where Tom wanted to understand systems, Ruth wanted to understand people, and she went about this with the same watchful, careful quality she'd had since birth, observing and absorbing, and occasionally saying something that surprised adults with its precision. Clarence and Irene talked, in the evenings and the in-between times of the year, about what they wanted for their children, and the conversations had the quality of two people who were genuinely working something out together rather than one person convincing the other. They wanted for Tom and Ruth what Irene had had to fight for and what Clarence had been fortunate enough to grow up with, the ability to stand on their own ground and make honest decisions. The school was part of it. The work was part of it. The example of watching their parents deal honestly and with full respect for each other was, they both believed, the most important part. The decade turned. Arizona Territory continued its long push toward statehood. The railroad brought more settlers and more change to the region, not all of it good, and the valley changed with everything around it. Millhaven grew, new properties were settled on the surrounding land, and the character of the place shifted incrementally, the way places shift without anyone declaring that they're shifting. The Vaughn land, Irene still called it the Vaughn land, and no one disputed her right to name it as she liked, remained what it had been. The best watered, most carefully managed property in the valley, known throughout the region as both an honest and a productive operation. Irene, at 35, had an authority that came from more than years. It came from the specific kind of knowledge that is built by doing everything yourself during the years when no one else was going to do it, and by continuing to do it carefully and well after circumstances had changed enough that she didn't have to anymore. She was on the Millhaven Town Council by 1890, one of 2 women, and she argued for the things she believed needed arguing for, and listened carefully when she was wrong, and changed her position when the evidence warranted it, which was the kind of council member every town council needs more of than it usually gets. Bear, who had been on the ranch since before Irene had run it alone, and who had become so woven into the fabric of the place that imagining it without him was difficult, came to Irene in the summer of 1890 with something he'd been carrying for a while. His sister's family, what remained of it, was in a difficult situation on a small piece of land in the northern part of the territory, and he wanted to go and help them. Irene listened to the whole of it without interruption, and then she said, "How long do you need?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe it's permanent." "Then go," she said. "You have a family that needs you." "You've needed me here," he said. "You've been here when I needed you," she said. "We're all right now. Tom is learning fast and we've got Dooley and the others. Go take care of your people, Bear." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You will be here when I come back if I come back." "I'll be here," she said. He shook her hand, and then, in a departure from his usual reserve, he shook Clarence's hand and ruffled Tom's hair, and looked at Ruth with the serious attention he gave important things. And then he got on his horse and rode north. And the ranch was quieter in the particular way places get quieter when someone who has been part of them for a long time is no longer present. He did come back, as it turned out, 2 years later with his sister's family in tow, 6 people in total, looking for work and land, and a situation that was stable. Irene had 2 positions on the crew and offered them both. 3 members of Bear's family settled on a small piece of land, a few miles north of the Vaughn property, that Clarence helped them acquire at fair price through a private sale, and the connection between that family and the Vaughn ranch remained steady for years. By 1892, Tom was 9 and Ruth was 6, and the Vaughn ranch had 1,200 acres and a full dairy operation, and a reputation that reached well beyond Millhaven. Irene still worked the horses in the early mornings and still managed every aspect of the operation with the same precise, attentive energy she'd brought to it since Thomas had died and left it in her hands. Clarence still ran the land office, and still turned down work that required compromising his standards, and still argued, whenever a useful forum presented itself, for fairer treatment of the smaller landholders who were the most vulnerable to the pressures of development and expansion. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when the seasons allowed it. They still talked about everything. They still had the comfortable physical ease of two people who have been alongside each other long enough to know each other completely, with all the roughness and all the grace that complete knowledge requires. One October evening in that year, the air sharp and the cottonwoods golden again as they always were in October, Irene turned to look at him and said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if the engineers had rejected the alternate route?" "I think about it sometimes," he said. "What do you think would have happened?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I would have been honest with you about the eminent domain situation," he said, "which I was anyway. And I think the proceedings would have been difficult, but I think you would have found a way to preserve the core of the property even through that. You're not someone who runs out of options." "Enos," she said. "I don't know," he said. "I like to think I would have found a reason to come back regardless, but I don't know if you'd have wanted me to under those circumstances." She thought about this. "I think I would have wanted you to," she said. "I think I had already noticed you by then in a way that would have been hard to unnotice." "When had you noticed me?" he asked. "When you told me about the eminent domain option," she said. "You just arrived and you already told me the thing that was most useful for me to know, even though telling me was not in your professional interest." "It seemed like the right thing to do," he said. "Most people know what the right thing is," she said. "Fewer people do it when it's inconvenient." She reached over and found his hand in the dark. "That's when I noticed you." He held her hand and listened to the creak and the whippoorwill and the distant sound of Dooley saying something to the horses in the evening corral, and he thought about the morning he'd ridden into this valley with a satchel full of money and a contract already drafted, certain that he understood the situation, and about how completely and gratefully wrong he had been. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said. "I need you to know something." "What is it?" "When I rode in that first morning and saw you working the palomino in the corral, I had no idea that I was riding into the rest of my life." He paused. "I just wanted you to know that I understand what I have. I understand it clearly." She squeezed his hand steady and warm. "I know you do," she said, "and I know what I have." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "This is the life, Clarence. This is the one." The creek ran in the dark below the cottonwoods. The stars came out over the canyon walls, the vast western sky with all its particular autumn constellations. The lantern light from the kitchen window painted a warm square on the porch boards. Inside, Tom was doing his sums with the same methodical determination he brought to everything, and Ruth was telling a story to her doll in the soft, murmuring way she had, and somewhere Dooley had started whistling something off-key and cheerful, which he always did in the evenings, which had been constant and familiar for years now, which was one of the 10,000 small, regular things that made a life what it was. The satchel that Clarence had brought on that first morning had long since gone to a different purpose. Irene had used it for her council papers, which struck them both, when they realized it, as exactly the right fate for it. The money had gone back into the company, and the contract that had been drafted in that satchel had been replaced by the easement document, which was filed properly in the county records, and which proved over time to have been the right solution for everyone involved. All those things were settled and complete, resolved into the past where they belonged, leaving this: the valley, the creek, the land, the children, the man and the woman on the porch holding hands in the October dark, and the years ahead of them that were going to be good. Not because the world was simple, or because difficulty didn't come, because it always did, and it always would: droughts and low cattle prices and political stupidities, and the slow grinding injustices of the territory working themselves out generation by generation. Not fast enough and not fairly enough, but still working, still changing, still being pushed by people who wouldn't stop arguing for what was right. but good because this was real and chosen and honestly made by two people who had met in a negotiation about land and found, somewhere in the space between the money and the truth, something neither of them had been looking for and both of them had needed completely. Copper the Palomino stood in the east corral below the house, dozing in the dark, a warm shape in the autumn night. Newton stood beside her, philosophical as always, unconcerned with anything that could not be addressed by being still and letting the world sort itself out. Above the canyon walls, the stars kept their old slow turning. The creek ran on. The light from the kitchen window was steady and warm. Irene Vaughn, who had handed back every dollar and told the man her price not in money but in honesty, not in compromise but in full and equal terms, held her husband's hand in the dark and was, as she had told him she was, extraordinarily happy. And Clarence Whitaker, who had ridden into the valley thinking he understood what he was there to acquire, and who had ended up acquiring something that could not be measured in dollars or deeded over or taken by eminent domain, felt the deep and simple satisfaction of a man who has found what he was actually made for and knows it clearly and does not take it for granted. The October night settled around the ranch with its particular cold sweetness, carrying the smell of dry grass and creek water and wood smoke from the kitchen chimney, and everything was present and accounted for, and nothing was left unresolved, and the story was not finished. Stories of lives lived honestly and well never entirely finish. But it was whole, and it was right, and that was enough. That was more than enough.